Hi everyone. This week I'm going to progress from the beginner's knitting that we did last week and show you some purl stitches which will allow us to do some stocking stitch. I'm going to show you how to fix some mistakes like I've got here, and I'm going to try and demonstrate how to keep your knitting nice and flat by putting some garter stitches at the sides. I wondered if how everybody got on last week. I know that we were just concentrating on the knit stitch, so your work will look like this. But what you might find, not so much with garter stitch, but when you move on to stocking stitch, you can find that your work starts to kind of curl up on itself and it won't sit flat. So I'm going to show you how to avoid that from happening as well. And last week I forgot to demonstrate the long tail cast on, so I'm going to show you that this week too. I can see a few people joining now. And I'm going to show you how to do this long tail cast on, which is great if you want a stretchy cast on edge at your work. So with a normal cast on, we would just make a slip knot and have a short tail here, but with a long tail cast on, like its name, we need a long tail. One trick, this will become a little bit clearer, so say if you had a pattern that said cast on 50 stitches, there is nothing worse than getting to the end and going, oh, I don't have enough of a long tail left. Now this will make a little bit more sense once I've demonstrated it, but a great way to estimate how much yarn you need is just to wrap it around the needle quite loosely. I'm not pulling too tight. So I've got 5 wraps there. I'll then slip it off, and I've pinched it between my fingers, so I know that that length is going to do 5 stitches. I know there's a few people saying that they'll watch later, so that's great. You can replay this in your own time if you want to. I managed to save it to YouTube as well, because I know that not everyone's on Facebook, so it's available to watch there, and this one will be probably tomorrow at some point. It did take a wee while for me to download the video. Anyway, so back to what I was showing. So this length here I know is about 5 stitches. So if I double that up, I now know that this is what I need for 10 stitches, and you can then 20, 30, 40, 50, and you'll never have, you won't need all of that, but that way you'll never have too little tail left. We're going to be casting on 15, so I have probably about, I'm estimating here, maybe 50, 60 centimetres. Don't worry too much about it. So I just did the slip knot, and if you need a demo of that, that was in, there's a slower version in last week's video. And I'm going to slip it on to my needle and just tighten it up a little bit. So the tail end here, I'm going to pop over my thumb, and then the tail that's attached to your ball of yarn over my forefinger. So this one is a little bit fiddlier. If you wanted just to stick to the simple cast on that I demonstrated last week, that's fine. But this one gives a really nice stretchy cast on, and it's another good skill to have. So what I've done, I've got my thumb and my forefinger through the yarn, and then I'm going to use these fingers here just to grasp the bottom end, just so that I've got a little bit, they're pulled a little bit tighter. I've got my finger on this loop because there will be a tendency for this to slip off, just to begin with. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to stretch it out, and if you look at it like this, it's sometimes called the slingshot method, because if you pull them down, you see how you've got one loop on this side and one loop on that side. Let me just grab these again. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go underneath this first loop and then over the top of the back one and over and slip it over the top. My fingers are in exactly the same position, so this is the same movement that we're doing, and we're going underneath this strand, over the back strand, and then this loop that's on the thumb, we're just lifting it over the top. Under, over. Does take a little bit of practice, but hopefully you can watch this back and rewind it as many times as you need to. And as I say, as I mentioned last week, there's so many different ways to cast on stitches. So just go with whatever you feel most comfortable with. But this is a long tail cast on because we're using the long tail that we pulled out at the beginning, like that. I'm going to cast on 15 stitches because that's what we went for last week, I think. And this week we're going to do knit and purl stitches. So we did the knit ones last week, so there will be a bit of a refresher because what I'm going to show you is how to knit stocking stitch, which looks a little bit like this section here. So kind of, you know, the traditional idea of what a knit stitch looks like. Let's check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Too many. So we'll pull those off. And I'm going to just knit this first row. So same as last week, I'm going to show you, I'll demonstrate both, but I'm going to start off with my yarn in my left hand because that's what I feel most comfortable with. And a lot of you fed back to me that this was like a revelation. I find it's much, much easier for kids to handle. Let me know how you got on in the comments if you did give it a try and whether this technique made a difference. I know that some people were saying that they found it much faster. So that's really good. I'm glad. Sometimes I make these videos and I think, who on earth is going to watch them? Is it a complete waste of time? And it's just lovely to get some feedback from people to say that they've enjoyed it, or, you know, and if only a handful of people learn this new skill and they get some enjoyment from it, then hey, we've achieved something. It's hard going just now, isn't it? So I'm just knitting all of these stitches. And if you haven't seen last week's one, this technique is officially called the continental style because I am wrapping my yarn around the needle with my left hand. And that way I'm not having to take my hands off the needles at any time. So I've done one row of knit stitches. I'm now going to demonstrate the purl stitch. What will we do first? I will show you purl stitches with my right hand to begin with. So before, with knit stitches, we were going in from here out through the back, but now our needle is going to be coming in this direction. So from right to left. Eileen's saying, I've been knitting for years and learning new skills here. That's great, good. You know, sometimes I do wonder, like, am I making it too simple? Because I know that some people will be like, yeah, I know exactly how to knit, but I want to make this as accessible as possible for everyone. Yeah, so our purl stitch will always come this direction, from right to left. And we want to pay attention to where this yarn is. It should always be, if we're working like this, our yarn should always be towards us. So forward. In a pattern, it'll sometimes say yarn forward or yarn in front. And this is in front, that's behind us. So to begin with, I'm going to come up like this and my yarn is down this side. And I'm taking the right hand to wrap around the needle. Oh, sorry, dropped something else. And then, same as last week, we're just rotating the needles around like this, and slipping it off. I'll do it again. It'll be a little bit more straightforward now because my yarn's in the right position and I'm wrapping around the needle like that. I'm kind of pulling it backwards so that I've like pulled it onto the needle and it's not going to slip off the end of here. And yeah, like before, I've got contact with this needle and I'm rolling this one around and through that stitch and lifting it off. Split the yarn there. Around and slip off. If you want to send me any pictures, I know that some people put some pictures in the comments last week, which was brilliant. And it might inspire people to give it a go. I know that Gillian, your girls got on great with knitting, and we were trying to remember how old they were, so they must be coming up for 10, we think. So all the way along like this, and I think what I'll do, Caroline's saying I remember now. It's funny, like a lot of people will come to one of my beginners knitting classes and they'll say, no, I'm a complete beginner, I don't know how to knit. And then quite quickly, within the first maybe 10-15 minutes, I'm like, you've definitely knitted before, but it comes back to you. You know, just the process and what your hands are doing, it almost is like, oh yeah, I remember this. And I think that's one of the reasons that I enjoy this so much, is that it's just something soothing and repetitive, and you can almost, after a wee while, do it without thinking. I know that at the moment it might be like, what is she doing? But I promise you, in time, it does get easier. Right, I'm just going to unwrap some more yarn. I will demonstrate this one with my right hand now, because I did it with my right before for the purl stitches. Because I know that holding it in your left might be completely alien to you, and you might be keen to just continue with the way that you were originally taught. I'm watching this through the phone, so I'm a bit clumsy with the needles. There we go. And then the next row, we're going to purl. So by alternating our rows between knit rows and purl rows, we produce stocking stitch. So you'll have all your bumps on the back and then all the nice neat V's on the front. You'll start to see it up here. So there's our V's. This is our stocking stitch. And then on the back is all our bumps. Right, I'm going to demonstrate now doing the purl stitch with the left hand. Now, it is something that I really needed to practice. And also, as I was having a wee practice just now, I find it quite hard with these chunky needles, but we'll give it a go. We'll see how we get on. So, my yarn is over my left forefinger. I've got a little bit of tension like we did when we were doing knit stitches, a little bit of tension around my little finger, and then this finger is the one that's going to be doing all the work. So I'm wrapping it around the needle like this, and my finger comes forward. I'll do this really slowly, and you'll see, I think I mentioned last week, when I first started doing continental style, I would switch between my right and left hand depending on whether I was knitting or purling. And that's absolutely fine. The process is exactly the same. So you'll see my needle is going behind the yarn, which I know I'm holding it over the back here, but technically it's still on this side of the work. I'm going underneath that one, and then I'm using this finger just to hold it back and in place as I roll the needle around and slip it off. So the main thing to remember is that your right hand needle always needs to go behind this yarn too, not this way. You'll get yourself in a tangle and you'll end up with extra yarn overs if you do it that way. So we want the needle to come behind and up through the stitch like this. I actually looked out a smaller needle and yarn. I think that was what was dropping on the floor just now to demonstrate this, because it's a little bit more fluid. It's just easier for my hands to handle. Oops. But I think we'll just keep going with this one just now. Caroline's saying, my mum is a fast knitter and she did Aran jumpers. Yokes of different colours. Yes. My job as a kid was winding the yarn. Yeah, my mum used to knit Aran jumpers when we were little. She used to knit them for a lady, actually, who then sold them, probably at an extortionate price to tourists. But Caroline, I know that you have been knitting over this last week or so, so it's great. I'm glad it's coming back to you. So we're ready just to knit again. One of the things I wanted to show you was that, where is it? Here's a piece of just stocking stitch, which is what we've been producing on the needles just now. This is just a few more rows. But when I've taken it off the needle, you'll see that these edges are starting to curl in. And if you were doing, say, a scarf to begin with, that could be quite frustrating because your scarf suddenly becomes half the size. Caroline's saying she used to have 4 small needles all at once. I bet she was doing socks or sleeves, maybe. Annette, thank you so much for taking the time to make your video. Your explanations are very helpful, enjoyable. Ah, thank you. I'm really glad, because sometimes I feel like a bit of a dafty doing things like this. I'm glad it's useful for some people. Yeah, so this is what you need to do to stop your edges, or one of the techniques that you can use to stop the edges from rolling in. This, I've done 3 stitches differently, and then I've got my stocking stitches in the middle. I went with 3 stitches because I wanted it to look definitely different, but you could probably get away with just doing 1 or 2 stitches like this. So we would normally knit as normal. Let me move this one out of the way. Right, we'll knit this row as normal, and then on our purl rows we're going to do the edge stitches slightly different, and that stops the edges from rolling in. Let me know if anybody has any other questions. I am struggling to read like the full comments just with the way that my phone is being held on the cradle, so I apologise if I stop mid-sentence. So we knit as normal all the way along, but then when we turn to do a purl row like this, rather than go straight into doing a purl stitch here, we're going to just knit the first 3. And this is where you could get away with just knitting the first one and the very last one. But just to show you exactly and show you really clearly the difference between the stitches, knit the first 3, and then I'm going to go back into just regular purl stitch. So I've got my yarn. My yarn was here for the knit stitches, and when I'm moving between knit and purl stitches, I need to remember whether my yarn is away from me like this or whether it's towards me. Like so, yarn in front and yarn behind. So my yarn definitely wants to be in front because I'm about to do a purl stitch, and my needle is going behind that yarn and into the stitch. Now this will be a little bit trickier for younger ones. And if you want to just carry on with the garter stitch, that's probably for the best. We haven't progressed. My daughter hasn't progressed from knit stitches. I don't want to overcomplicate things. To be honest, I don't have the patience right now with all the homeschooling. We're not going to mention that though. So I've just finished purling these stitches, and my yarn would naturally be here ready to purl these last 3, but we're going to switch back to doing knit stitches. So my yarn comes between the needles and it's now behind, which means that it's in the right position for knitting these last 3. So if it was in a pattern, I think we probably will do a session at some point about deciphering patterns. A pattern would say knit 15, and then on the opposite row you would be doing knit 3, purl, I'm going to estimate maybe 9, whatever I have here, and then knit 3. So what you can see is that you get this garter bumps like we did last week along the edges, and then you've got your nice flat stocking stitch in the middle, and your edges aren't going to curl up. I also have a piece here that I've just slipped off the needles. Let me pop them back on some needles, because I'm going to show you how to fix some mistakes. So this one, for example, I've just done straight stocking stitch. I haven't done any garter stitches at the edge, but I've done one stitch wrong right in the middle, and I'm going to show you how to drop that down and fix that mistake. I think we tried to demonstrate that last week and it was a bit tricky to see. Sorry, I've got my hands out of shot there. So I'm just slipping these stitches back onto the needle, and I'm going to look for my crochet hook. I think I've just dropped it. Yeah. Here we go. So a crochet hook can be really handy for when you come to pick up any dropped stitches. I don't know if... Yeah, I didn't quite finish that row. Let me just finish this row here. Okay. So what I would usually do is knit along to where my mistake is. And you don't need to rip it back. What I'm going to show you is kind of the ladder technique, where you can just drop down one stitch and correct it. And this is where knitting is great for stuff like this. Crochet you can't fix as well. So I've just knitted to one stitch before we've got this bump that's the wrong way round. So what I've done here, I've obviously knitted a stitch on a purl row, or I've purled a stitch on a knit row, and that's created this bump on the wrong side. So what I'm going to do is slip it off the needle. Try and make sure that I'm doing this in shot, and I'm just dropping down the stitches all the way down to the one that's wrong, and I'll pull that out. Now this one here, we want to kind of grab that because we don't want it to ladder and go all the way further down. But what I'm going to do is just pick up, and you can see clearly, this is why last week's one, it was just too tight and I couldn't show you properly. But I've got my stitch on the crochet hook, and I'm making sure, sometimes they can get tucked in behind, but I'm making sure that I've got a strand from each stitch going up. And I'm going to go underneath that one, grab it with the hook, and go pull through the stitch under the next rung of the ladder, if you like, and pull it up, pull up. It might look slightly different, your tension might look slightly different on this one, but once it's been stretched out and moved around and things, it does become a little bit more even. So you might need to distribute your stitches a little bit. But there we go, that's that one fixed. So don't be afraid if you come to a certain point in your knitting and you find that, for example, you've got a dropped stitch and you come along and you're like, oh, what have I done? I'm going to have to take it all the way back to here. You really don't. As long as you've got the kind of row of stitches, or I guess that would be a column of stitches rather than a row, on these needles, and you might want to push them right back so that they don't slip off the end. Jane's saying, I've never used a crochet hook to do this, it's much easier. You can use your knitting needle as well. Let me go down a couple more. So if you want to see it with the crochet hook again, you can rewind this. But then let me show you with the knitting needle. So I've just gone into the dropped stitch from front to back, and I've kind of spread out these rungs of the, I like to call it rungs of a ladder. Emma's saying she didn't know that you could do that to always pull everything back. No, you can drop down and you can fix mistakes from rows before. So this is how to do it with your needle. We're going to go underneath the rung of the next ladder, and I'm going to use my, sorry, I know this is curling up a little, left needle, and I'm going in like this to slip it over the top. Do the same again, go underneath this strand, left needle into this stitch here, and I'm lifting it over the top. Melissa's saying, I'm sure this will come in handy. Yeah, definitely. I mean, even experienced knitters will use this technique to fix mistakes. We've all done it. And I'm just going to slip it back onto here. And that's it fixed. I think it's easier to demonstrate with the crochet hook because you can see how flat your stitch is. It's maybe a little bit harder to demo with the needles, but hopefully that helps some people. So to be honest, we've probably covered everything that I set out to show you this week, and I wondered whether next Friday whether we should cover some increases and decreases, and maybe join in work in the round so that you can work knitted pieces in the round, so you could do hats and things without having to sew it up at the end. I'll show you one other thing actually before we finish up, that when you do come to sew things up at the end, let me pull in this one instead, it's sometimes a good idea to slip this first stitch, and that just gives you a nice neat edge. See how this, if I was sewing these together, I would probably be like, okay, that looks like a stitch here, but what's this one? And that looks okay there, but that looks a little bit uneven. If you slip the stitch, the first stitch that way, so we're going from right to left, so it's just slipped purlwise and then knit every stitch along, you'll get a nice neat edge, which makes it a little bit easier when you come to join your work. So I know there's quite a few people watching just now, but if you have any questions that you want to ask me, then ask away and I'll try and answer just now. The workshop is in utter chaos at the moment because I have a yarn show, a virtual yarn show tomorrow for Yorkshire Yarn Fest. So at the end I'll take the phone out and I'll show you the mayhem in here. So I've knitted the very last stitch here, but I'm going to slip this one. So I'm slipping it purlwise, and I've gone under it just like I would if I was going to purl that stitch. My yarn is in front, so my needle is behind that yarn and the loop. So I've slipped it, I've not knitted it at all, I've not purled it, I've not worked it, and then I'm going to purl all the way to the end. And it just gives a nice, neat finish to your yarn. Does anyone have any other questions at all? I know this has been a really quick one today. I tended to, I kind of went on and on and on last week. I think what I might do as well is write out a very simple pattern so that we can do a bit of pattern reading one Friday. Because I think that's probably the next stage that you think, okay, I can do the basics, but I have no idea what that pattern is telling me to do, and cover some abbreviations. How does that sound? So I've only slipped this one stitch on each side, and it will look a little bit longer, but I promise once you've done a few more rows, it's nice and neat and obvious. And when you would come to sew things up, you would go through this loop. Makes it really neat finish, because what you then end up with is like that column there. Say we were joining this in the round, it would then be joined up with that column there, and it's nice and neat. Emma is asking, if you slip the first one, do you need to increase the number of stitches in the row at the beginning, or do you just slip off at the end? So no, we don't need to increase the number of stitches in the row. Do you just slip off at the end? I'm not 100% sure. I'm maybe just not reading the full comment there. It's kind of hidden in the phone cradle. Sorry, Emma. If you slip the first one, I think I know what you mean. So say you were following a pattern in here, would you need an extra? Yes, so you're going to slip off the first one. Say you were working with something that was just a long column and you had no shaping or anything like that. You would just slip the first one at the beginning end, not at each end. You would just slip the beginning one. So the beginning of this row, and then knit, 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 knit all the way to the end. And then when you came to turn, you would just be slipping that one before you do purl, purl, purl. You would finish with a purl stitch, turn it, slip that one, and then knit it. Does that make a little bit more sense? I think probably what you were getting at as well was possibly if you were working on a pattern, whether you would need to cast on an extra stitch to allow for this slip stitch. But no, some patterns will tell you to slip the first one anyway. And in a pattern, if you do ever have to slip a stitch, it will always be purl-wise unless it states otherwise. Hopefully that helps answer your question. But yeah, keep practicing. Play back the videos whenever you need to, and yeah, just reach out if you've got any questions. I do have a Cookston Crafters group where we try and help each other with knitting and crochet problems and to show off things that we've knitted and things. And please don't feel like my beginner's piece isn't worthy of sharing. It absolutely is, and you'll have loads of people who will be ready to cheer you on and give you any help and advice. So it's called Cookston Crafters, and you're all welcome to join that group. I will leave you now, and I'll be back next Friday to show you some increases and decreases. Good luck with your knitting, and have a good weekend.